Hello to everybody. This is Davide Strozzi. I'm the CTO of Campus Party. I'm really honored to be here in this wonderful stage at this first great edition of Campus Party Digital in the world. So it's an honor for me to be here today because we reach out for one of the most important moments of our main stage program. So I want to introduce immediately this fantastic person that you are going to meet together with us. So for me, it's a pleasure to introduce a worldwide famous person that is a cybersecurity expert, a whistleblower that we will have the honor to listen to his vision about how to share, how to reboot the world. So please give a great welcome, a virtual one, to Edward Snowden.
I would say this is sort of an unusual event. It's funny, we're all spread all over the world in different rooms. Everybody's locked up. But for me, this is how I've always lived. So much of my life, as I think is increasingly the case for you, wherever you are, is intermediated by these screens. We spend less time outside and more time staring into glass or through glass to connect with that larger world, with something beyond ourselves. And so that's why it's particularly important, I think, as we see the world happening through these screens. And increasingly, it feels like something distinct from us, something apart from us, something that we are witnessing rather than participating in. That you look at it. I want you to think about the world as you see it now and what you see happening in it. And ask yourself, is this your will? Is this what you wanted? Did you agree to this? Is this consistent with the vision of the future that you want to see? It's interesting to me that we seem to be living in this moment that feels much closer to what I think is the standard of history, rather than our ideal of modernity, in that the institutional powers of our day, when you think about the structures that actually affect the world, organized groups of people who have assumed for themselves some mandate, whether it's to conduct business, whether it's to govern the lives of others, whether it's to make war. These institutional powers, they don't seem to particularly care about your answer to that question. Is this what you wanted? Is this okay? Did you agree to it? And I think when we look at those institutions and their responses to that question, or rather ask for their feelings about our answer to that question, it's informative, because legislators would say that it doesn't matter. They control the law. Police would say that you don't have a choice as to whether or not you agree to this, because they have the gun, they have the baton. And Facebook would say, click OK to continue. And if you don't, you can't do anything, because they control the policy. And through the policy, they control the platform. And through the platform, they control the public. They control all of us and aggregate our lives, or at least exercise some great level of influence over it by gating us off, separating us from the things that we need to do to connect and engage in just what is considered today a normal life. And so there is this presumption amongst all of them that merely by existing, merely by, click OK to continue, merely by continuing, they say that you agreed to this. But I don't think that you did, and I bet you don't think so either. The reality is these institutions, all of them, they pretend that we consent to their actions. They pretend that we agree because of where we were born, or where we have no choice but to live, or lead a life to which we have no alternative because of economic insecurity, or political barriers, or barriers to movement. And I think it can be something as simple as, you opened a website, you turned on your phone. All of these things today have consequences which we are not informed about, even if you read the 600 pages of legalese. Because one of the very first terms in these terms of use that are applied to our lives is that these terms can change at any time. A statement that's as true for government as it is for corporations. And it's time that we recognize these are forced choices. If we don't have an alternative but to click OK, if there's no other option but to say no thanks, I would rather have my privacy. No thanks, but I would rather not have you collect this data. No thanks, but I would rather not have you apply violence to minorities, to people who are unlike me, or even to people who are like me. I would like to be treated fairly. I would like to see a more equitable world. I would like to see a better world, and I would like to make that happen. I would like to see politicians who are reasonable rather than extremist. I would like to see police that are worried about public safety rather than state security. And I think the fact that so many of our interactions in modern life, so many of the activities that we have to engage in are intermediated as our lives are by this glass. They are separated from us by this gate of a forced choice. We need to recognize that that is not consent, and the law needs to recognize that that is not consent. The companies need to recognize that is not consent, and the only way that that happens is if we recognize that that is not consent, not in any way that really matters. And I think that is what's happening today. I think that's what we see around the world. I think that's, for a large part, what is responsible for the rising tide of anger that we feel in so many ways. People don't feel a sense of agency. They recognize that things in the world are not going in the right direction, but, and they don't agree with it. And they do care about it, despite what people say to the contrary. But they don't feel that they have the ability to change it. And that's what we're talking about when we're talking about consent. We need to realize that that lack of consent matters. We need to realize that we matter. And the only way that this changes, right, because what we're seeing is a divorce between the individual and the institutional in terms of power and accountability. We have the institutions that wield the greatest influence over society, whether we're talking about presidents, people like Donald Trump, whether we're talking about people in Hungary, whether we're talking about people in Brazil, whether we're talking about people in Russia or China, new presidents for life. We need to recognize that there seems to be nothing they can do that results in them facing a serious consequence, whereas the smallest infractions of our lives that can even be civil rather than criminal are instantly crystallized and memorialized at the moment of mistake and captured into a permanent record that's held and controlled by these groups, again, whether they are commercial or whether they are governmental. And we have no influence to change them. But that's what we need. We need things to change. And, so many people are asking for change. They're basically complaining. They're writing articles. They're going, Facebook, you need to do this. They're going, government, please do this for us. But the sad truth of history, when you look at it, they are actually better than the problems we had in the past, as hard as it is to say. The world is getting better. But we are at a moment of regression. And the only way we make things get better again is through struggle and sacrifice, because change is never something that is granted. Concessions are not given to us by power. Our rights are not gifts. They are prizes that are won. And that won't happen without you. That won't happen simply because you believe in something. That won't happen simply because you care about something. That will only happen when you stand for something and you actively make a change happen. And that starts with you. I guess if you can hear me, let's go to questions.
Yes, yes. Thank you very much, Edward, because your words are really inspiring us. And we need more transparency. We need to know that effectively our rights are not in a word, a prize that we have to win. We have to struggle. And that's for sure is something that we have to remind always. So it's time for the question. We have very great question from all over the world. So we will have for journalists to place this question. So we start with Christopher Reynolds from the Canadian Press from Canada. And so please, Chris, enter into the meeting.
Thank you very much, Edward, for taking time to chat with us today. It sounds like not just consent, but an empowered and an informed consent are all the more necessary in the time of much increased reliance on virtual communication and virtual consumption, which we're in now in the era of COVID-19. But before getting back to what you were saying, I just wanted to touch on that subject that's dominated headlines for the past 4 months. We know COVID-19 has upended the lives of so many people. Folks have lost their jobs. They've been homeschooling their children, and they've just been isolated from friends and family. But as you were saying, you've been effectively stranded in Moscow since 2013, and you've been video conferencing and giving virtual sit-downs and chats and working remotely for the past 7 years. So I know you've described yourself as more of an indoor cat, but just to make it personal for a second, I'm wondering how COVID-19 has affected your own life, and basically, how are you doing?
I mean, it's been tougher, I think, for everybody. The isolation, even for somebody who is normally quite driven to keep to themselves, it's an interesting thing. The difference between when you choose to do something and when you have no alternative but to do something. Mandatory isolation is a very different thing than a voluntary isolation. But I think I've kept up quite well. I think all of us understand, or at least not all of us, many of us understand why we do this. I do think there is a mistake in a lot of mandatory restrictions on behavior. I do think the best way to win public participation is through persuasion. And I think that is effective and can be effective. I am very worried by the rising tide of anti-intellectual sentiment around the world. I am very concerned by how we have seen things like scientific advice be derided. But we also need to recognize and I think act with real compassion in realizing that experts have been wrong. Institutions have been wrong in many cases. And if we do not acknowledge that, and we simply continue to rely on these kind of mandates, coming from authorities, what we are doing is we're moving towards an authoritarian society. We can hope that it will be a benevolent kind of authoritarianism, but I think if we look around at the leadership of the world today, that is a faint hope.
I just wanted to turn to the subject of that political, thorny subject of 5G. Many Western countries continue to grapple with whether to bar Huawei from their networks. Germany, France, and other EU members have decided to let the telecommunications giant into their networks. Australia and the US are not, citing security concerns. Meanwhile, Canada and the UK are still mulling which path to take. Here in Canada, our public safety minister is actually leading a security review on this subject. I wanted to ask you, what are the risks of allowing Huawei, with its strong ties to Beijing and the Communist Party, into a 5G-enabled network that undergirds the so-called Internet of Things? Are the dangers overblown, or are they under the radar of most citizens?
Well, 5G underpins a lot more than just the Internet of Things. I mean, this is the new mobile standard that's going to be used for connection and data transmission. And this is something it's interesting that this has now become a point of concern. And it's really only because Chinese industry has been the market leader on pushing this stuff forward. They had things that were cheaper and they were functionally better than the Western alternatives. Now, how that came to be, is another thing, whether it's industrial espionage, whether it's legitimate innovation, whether it's different regulatory regimes. There's a zillion different explanations, and the answer is probably all apply in different measures. But then when we look at this from the security context, it's interesting as someone who formerly worked for the NSA and who remembers quite well in 2013 the revelations of mass surveillance. When you look at this from the perspective of the intel community, there's a lot of things that are used in public messaging that are simply false and misleading. There is this sort of presumption that like Huawei has baked a backdoor into their network switches that like the intelligence community knows about, but it's not publishing out there. If that were true, Canada and Germany would not just be studying this. They would not be founding reviews. They would have simply gone, this is true. We've seen the intelligence. We've seen the evidence. It's not happening. The reality is it's not anything quite so black and white. When you look at how the intelligence community of the Western world, and we could say the United States here, it doesn't really matter because when we look back at 2013, the reality is the U.S. intelligence community is really the Anglo intelligence community. It's called the Five Eyes Surveillance Network. The United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. And they all sort of pool their ingestion, their intake in many different forms of what they get from surveillance. And they put this in this common bucket that their analysts can sift through, they can task, they can look at these different things. They've been doing this for a long time, right? This happened on 1G, 2G, 3G, 4G, and now we have this on 5G. So when you look back at the Cold War, in the intelligence community, when you work at the CIA, when you work at the NSA, you're not allowed to take your cell phone into the building. You have to leave it in your car. You can't take it in the office. You walk through metal detectors. If I brought my cell phone to my desk, it was what's called a security violation. You have to get walked out to the car with a security guard, like people write a report. It's a real problem. The reason why is they were concerned the adversary, which at the time was the Soviets, just in the early days of the standards, and then now as it becomes increasingly global, as everybody, they were worried that they could turn your devices, electronic devices, whatever they were, personal that you brought in the office, into a spying device. And the reason they were worried that the Soviets could do this is because we were doing it. And there is always this presumption that if we can do it, they can do it. Because from the counterintelligence perspective, you have to presume that if you're smart enough to do it, they are too. And so the reality is when we talk about Facebook, when we talk about, any of these major national telecommunications companies collecting records about the movements of phones, about the connections between them, the social graph, who you call when, how long the call existed, you have an intensely detailed picture of everyone's life, right? Where does that come from? That comes from operating the network. We use that every day in the Western intelligence community to extraordinary effect. And we know they do too. So this is not really so much a question of, I think, of there being some sinister like kill switch or backdoor. It's more a question of if a foreign company controls the software that runs the critical infrastructure that every life in your country has to pass through in its daily means, how do you enforce and regulate and monitor the way that's controlled? And it fundamentally comes down to trust. And this is really a question about, do they trust China not to abuse this privileged position in their system? And the answer for some countries is no. The answer for other countries is they go, well, we've already trusted US companies or Norwegian companies or Swedish companies to manufacture similar equipment and place it in a place like Germany, right? So we have some exposure here. What's the difference if it's another country? And it's, I think, a much more nuanced and complex conversation than is publicly represented. The reality is, if you are not domestically producing your telecommunications equipment, if you are not domestically controlling your telecommunications equipment and routing, you are exposed to some level of vulnerability. And that increases the more people outside of your domestic supply chain you introduce. But even in the case where it is domestically introduced, there's a question of how is that company using it? You know, do you trust a Canadian telecommunications provider to respect your privacy as a Canadian? I would hope the answer is actually no. Because if you thought otherwise, it's wrong. Like legally, they will do everything within the law to avoid being sanctioned. But as far as being good stewards of private information, nobody in the world is meeting that standard on a mass scale. However, that is not to say the threats here are equivalent. There is a distinction between domestic and international abuse. There's a difference between country A and country B. But I think when the core takeaway here is the public conversation happening around do we let Huawei sell switches into our core network or do we borrow them from it is not being honestly represented for what it really is. This is less about public safety, I think, than it is about power and which institutions and which companies have that power. One of the core things here comes also to legal wiretapping. If the Canadian Secret Service wants to monitor somebody on a Huawei switch, what happens if that switch is too secure? They have to go to the company and they have to ask for help getting it in and applying a wiretap. They might be a lot more comfortable leveling that task to a Western telecommunications services company that's cooperated with them for the last 60 years than they would with a Chinese company that's going to talk to the MSS the next day.
Thanks very much, Edward. I'll let my colleagues ask some more questions. Thank you
Another
again.
colleague from Italy. So I'm glad to invite on this virtual stage Bruno Ruffilli from La Stampa, Italy. So Bruno, please go ahead with your question. Thank you.
Hi there, hi Ed, and thank you for my question. So we have been told that contact tracing apps can help fight the pandemic. And Apple and Google, as you are aware, of course, teamed to build a common platform, which has been adopted by many countries, including Italy. And so they say they have no access to data produced from these apps, and all governments say the same thing. But the platform will remain on our smartphones even after the pandemic has gone. So how can we be sure that this is not another way to collect people's data?
This is a great question, and I think the answer to it is baked into the question itself. This idea of, okay, you know, we build these extraordinary capabilities into our devices. How do we make sure they're not used for an ulterior purpose the day after the pandemic is over? And what we are missing from a lot of these platforms and programs is a drop-dead date, something that's baked into the software, a kind of expiration date that goes in 3 months. If this is not renewed, if there's not, you know, a ruling by whichever group is trusted, that these things will phase out, that they'll be shuttered, that they'll be mothballed. Now, I have read the technical white papers for Apple and Google's joint proposal for baking this stuff into the operating system. And I have to tell you, it's actually a lot better than the national alternatives in terms of being designed with privacy in mind. When you look at things like the Australian COVID tracking app, it was an absolute privacy nightmare. They were just turning on basically every geolocation contact tracing kind of capability on the phone to create a perfect record of your movements to the best of their capability, and then sending that out to all of these outside databases where then it's up to them to control. Whereas the Google Apple one, the information is more held on the phone, which is kind of similar, to how your fingerprint is held when you enroll in like biometrics. It's not sort of sent elsewhere, it's on the device. And then later you have an option, if you're diagnosed or whatever, to share this information by voluntarily uploading it to international or national databases. And these kind of things where the idea is around the individual consent, the user consent, you have control of your data and then you voluntarily share it. This is a better model than we have seen in the past. The question is it good enough? Can we trust it? I think the danger in doing this, even though I think it's well-intentioned, they are playing a sort of a careful game of chicken, these companies. I think they are trying to get a capability out that they can go is good enough to provide what governments are asking for and perform the legitimate public health role in the least privacy impactful way for their industry, so that they avoid getting a law passed, a government mandate that says you guys must do this, you must build a more intrusive system because we're really worried about this public health emergency. And I think that is a real concern, but this is also the other side of the problem. Like we talked about with fingerprints. Okay, let's say your fingerprint is on your device, it's not used elsewhere, but now you have devices that can scan fingerprints that are all over the place. Great, you know, it's not been applied and abused on a mass scale yet. But then it moves to things like facial unlocking. All right, now we've got huge investments in facial recognition. And we go, okay, well, we're only going to do the same thing. We're just going to put your face print on your phone. It's not going to be shared out in the cloud, anything like that. But now there's 10 zillion companies out there who are building facial recognition technology. And guess what? There are countries like China that don't care so much about these privacy requirements. And so now you go to the market and somebody else's phone running a special app that's not mediated by the operating system, not mediated by Apple or Google, it's just some homegrown thing, takes a picture of everybody who enters the marketplace, everybody who enters the workplace. And now that's uploaded and held wherever they want, right? We have a proliferation problem in this space. So I want to be clear here. When we talk about these proposals by Apple and Google to bake things in the operating system, there's a real question of, should it be done at all? Is it strictly necessary? It could be better, I think. It could also be a lot worse. But the reality here is, who should ultimately be making these decisions about voluntariness of participation in society? Should there be these mandatory requirements? You get on a bus, you're tracked everywhere you go. You get on a metro, you're tracked everywhere you go. You go to the market, you go to work, you go to McDonald's, you go home, you go to the hospital. Anywhere you go, there's a record being made about you, about your private activities, about your private lives that you do not control. I don't think that is consistent or compatible with the idea of an open and free society. Once we go down that road and we begin compiling these records about people, perfect records of private lives in aggregate, and we go, they have no legal authority to influence them, their use, control them, and we start spreading the ownership and exploitation of this information about you to all of these different companies and then to all of these different governments and all of these different agencies, it becomes very hard to crawl back from that. These institutions, these agencies, these companies become accustomed to that as the normal way of doing business. We become accustomed to that. It's just the way things are. But we need to take a step back and ask ourselves, was it necessary in the first place? And this gets to the core question of contact tracing. Contact tracing can be very useful for a small and localized outbreak. When you've got 10 people in a city, 10 people in a country, 100 people in a nightclub who picked this up. But when it's 1,000 people, when it's 10,000 people, when it's 100,000 people, it's too late for contact tracing. And we are basically trying to solve a stage of the pandemic that happened 6 months ago.
So, speaking of personal data and information, a big problem that Facebook is trying to solve now is the quality of its content. So Facebook is full of hate speech, divisive opinions, fake news. And Zuckerberg says he wants to remove this kind of content from Facebook. But on the other hand, he relies precisely on them to fill the traffic on Facebook. So is there a way to get out of this dilemma, in your opinion? Basically, can we trust Mark Zuckerberg?
I'm going to take a little bit more of a controversial position here and say a lot of the problems we see on platforms like Facebook are problems we see in humanity. And Facebook is reflecting that. When we see things like extreme speech, when we see things like violence, terrorism, when we see things like hate speech, when we see simple ignorance, when we see lying on these platforms, that's because that's what people do when you look at them at scale in aggregate. There are good people and there are bad people. There are bad parts of good people. And when you see what everyone in the world is saying all at the same time, you see a lot of stupid stuff. And I would say it's, in fact, because we should not trust Mark Zuckerberg, that we should not try to turn platforms into the free speech police. When we decide that Facebook and Google and Twitter and YouTube should be in charge of deciding what can and cannot be said, we are on the wrong path. This is not to say there are no problems with what's being said on these platforms. There absolutely are. And what's new here is the scale that they reach, and that is a concern, and I think we need to contend with better ways of handling that. However, we need to think about who is it that should have the responsibility for handling these things. What we see right now is governments going, well, we don't want to handle this criminally. We don't want to see someone who literally blackmailed somebody on the internet, or somebody who made an assassination threat or targeted violence or something else that actually is criminal under the statutory code of whatever the jurisdiction is. And they don't want to handle the burden of policing that and investigating that. Instead, they go, well, companies, you do it. And companies on the other side are going, well, we don't want to do that. Governments, you should do that. But the reality is what we're seeing is the immaturity of our species. You have people who have never in their lives been listened to. In some cases, it's just because they're small, they're isolated, they're a normal person. In other cases, it's because they're ignorant or racist or they don't have anything worth saying. But now suddenly, for the first time in their lives, they can be heard. And so we are going through what I think of as the surly adolescent phase of the internet. I remember a younger internet when it was more childish. It was cooperative and creative. Everybody was just excited about the potential and possibilities of this thing. And we all worked together to help it grow. Now it's conflict-oriented. It doesn't want to listen to anybody. It knows best. And this is what we're struggling with. It's new, and the algorithms that sort of control our lives in terms of what you see on like YouTube thumbnails and whatnot are always oriented to novelty. They're oriented to emotional response. We see things that's, somebody going, because it's shock, right? We see outrage, little angry emojis and things like that, because they're trying to drive an emotional response because that's what's getting paid attention to. But I like to think just as children mature, our species matures and our relationships to technologies mature. And these same techniques that seem like they're the biggest problem in the world right now, because we are going through such a difficult and vulnerable period, these techniques will stop being effective on us in time because we'll simply be worn out. We've been shocked too many times. We've been outraged too many times. And we're seeing this being exploited by fascist and authoritarian movements around the world in a very real way today. They're trying to numb us into a non-response. But I think we will also get to the other side of that as well. We will begin reasoning. We will begin looking at things logically, and we will begin distancing ourselves from the emotional and looking at what the ultimate results and consequences of our participation in these platforms, in these relationships, and in our readership will become, is my hope.
Thank you so much. I think it's a very optimistic point of view, but
yeah. Well,
we have to struggle
no one is arguing that these days. Okay.
Yeah. So thank you, Bruno. And so we are going to get in contact with another colleague, that is Rafa Pandero from Prisa Radio in Spain. Please, Rafa, here you are.
Hi, Edward. Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? It's okay.
Hello. Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. Thank you for your work. Very interesting message, really. And thanks for having my questions too.
My pleasure.
First, you have mentioned Donald Trump in your speech. We all know that there's a new presidential election in USA in November. It's easy to imagine that under the Trump administration, you, Mr. Snowden, will be judged as a traitor and probably go to jail. But what if that's not the case? I mean, would you expect some kind of change in your personal situation in case of Joe Biden wins? Or it'll be exactly the same then under Trump administration, or even the same that it was under Obama administration. We remember how it was. And following this, if you can give us a personal point of view, do you feel that in some time would you ever be allowed to go back to the USA?
Yeah, so when we think about this idea of sort of Trump versus Biden as it relates to my personal circumstance, you have to understand that Biden was the vice president of Obama. He was in place without complaint as this revelation of mass surveillance in 2013 spread across the world. This is the same kind of policy, the same kind of politics that was responsible for these abuses in the first place. Trump is no reformist. Trump has not made any effective changes in terms of curtailing these abuses of mass surveillance. Instead, he has tried to politicize the issue for personal and political advantage. We have seen some interesting sort of defections from the public positions of the Obama administration once those people left the White House. For example, Obama's attorney general, Joe Biden was there for that, Eric Holder, said after he left the position of attorney general, remember, this is the guy who's saying I should go to prison for the rest of my life when he's in the White House. Once he's out of the White House, says he believed what I did was a public service. So there is, I think, shall we say, more of a historical perspective, an awareness once these people are out of power. But I think that revolving door, when these people re-enter power, they go back and they adopt their old positions. I don't expect any kind of evolution or improvement under a Biden White House that's any different from an Obama White House or a Trump White House. The reality is the mass surveillance of Americans and people around the world has bipartisan support in the elite circles of the United States government. It's a sad thing, but that's the basic reality of it. In the longer term, the fact that we see people like the man who's in charge of indicting me with crimes once he leaves power going, oh, yes, what he did, as much as I complained about it and said it was, the crime of the century when I was in power, eventually saying, no, this was a public service, indicates that with time, as this generation leaves power, things may be different. And the benefit that I have is I'm a very young man. And the people who are responsible for these crimes against the public are very old men. So we'll see what the future holds.
Okay, let's see what the future will give us. I want to ask you about the past. Let's go back to 2013. I think that the impact that your revelations as a whistleblower initially had seems to have faded out in some way. 7 years have passed since then. And now we can see that many people, and especially young people, have no problems in sharing their personal data and their personal information if they can stay connected. So, from your personal point of view, have you ever asked yourself, was it worth it? And have you ever regret of what you did?
Yeah, no, this is a good question. I've actually been getting the same question for the whole 7 years. As to regrets, I don't regret anything beyond not coming forward sooner. If I had known sooner, if I had been able to prove what was happening sooner, there's a chance that our response would have been more effective in reducing how far the epidemic of mass surveillance spread, how many countries it spread to before it was recognized for what it was, and it could be halted before it was a fait accompli, right? Because the reality is mass surveillance was rolled out around the world under cover of darkness. The public wasn't allowed to know it was happening because these governments were afraid that they would object, quite rightly, as we saw when the public did learn about it. But once it's already been done, there's this question of what do you do about it? And this brings up the second part of the question, which is the idea that sort of young people, they participate in these systems because they don't care about it. They don't have a problem with it. And I've been talking to audiences young and old for a long time now, since 2013. And the funny thing that I see is actually young people care more about privacy, digital privacy, than a lot of older audiences. And that's counterintuitive at first glance, because you think, well, they're on Instagram or WhatsApp or Facebook, you know, they're putting up pictures of whatever they had for lunch. Surely they can't care about this. But look, you guys that are on the stream right now, you know, probably balling your fist and shaking it. You know, the reality is, that's life. There is no alternative. You don't do this because you don't care about privacy. It's because you don't see a way to engage meaningfully in a standard public life, to be a part of your community, to share your friends, to get a job, you know, to make rent, to make payments, to engage in the economy, to engage politically, to live a life without being surveilled and exploited. I mean, look, economically, you're exploited. Politically, you are exploited. Of course, it stands to reason that your personal and private data will be exploited. But don't distinguish or don't mistake people's engagement with a system that exploits them with their consent to the same. And this is what brings us into the initial talk. They have to click OK to continue. The alternative is not to own a mobile phone. Who can survive without a mobile phone in the modern economy? Because even if you don't install a Facebook app, even if you don't ever open the Facebook app website, right? If it's an Android phone, you have to click OK to continue with Google. If it's an iPhone, you have to click OK to continue with Apple. And that's just to turn the damn thing on, right? We are being gated from interaction with the modern economy by these devices that are actively exploiting us. That does not mean we, young or old, don't care about privacy. That means we are denied a choice. And that may feel like it's the only way things are, the only way things can be, but that will change. You said things have faded. And I would actually argue against that as well. It is true that the common memory of, you know, what was in the particular newspaper stories in 2013 has faded. But the idea that the government and companies are collecting everything that you do online that they can get their hands on, everyone knows. Rather, that idea has penetrated further. It is a topic of debate to an even greater extent, I think, today, and a greater awareness today now than it was even back in 2013. Because in 2013, a lot of the conversation was about what governments were doing. Now it's about what private entities and corporations are doing. International relationships, covenants and laws in Europe, things like the GDPR, that couldn't be imagined pre-2013. In fact, those proposals were up for the chopping block. They were going to be axed. Now, GDPR is not enough. GDPR is not even effective but it is better than nothing. And what I'm trying to illustrate for you under my beliefs is what we are doing right now is climbing stairs. The first stair that we climbed was a really painful one because we didn't know we were going to be climbing upstairs. Nobody signed up to climb stairs. We didn't want to climb stairs, and it was a lot of work. Now we're up 10 stairs, right? And we're a little bit out of breath. We're like, I don't really want to do this anymore. But we're far enough out. We're far enough along now that we're actually closer to the top than the bottom. We're getting better at climbing stairs, and we've become so good at climbing stairs, we are no longer aware that we are still climbing, but we are.
Thank you very much, Rafa, for your question and for your answer, Edward. Again, really inspiring. And so it's a pleasure for me to introduce Pedro Doria from Brazil. So Pedro, welcome. So here you are.
Thank you, David. And Ed, thank you so much for taking these questions. I'm not sure you're familiar with that, but Brazil is intent on legislating over fake news. The new law will try to make platforms control disinformation. Do you believe the strategy could work, or better, what is the best strategy for democracies to deal with disinformation online?
I mean, it's difficult. I have not followed the details of the new law. It's a surprise to me in hearing this specifically happening in Brazil. It's not a surprise that it's happening. And the fact that it is happening in Brazil, I think, is a little bit sad. But given the state of democracy in Brazil, not entirely surprising. And I think anyone in Brazil knows these problems far better than I do. We often see these laws being used. We often see these claims being used. The problem of fake news being used for political effect. And I think that's really what this is about. It's about being able to control the public understanding of reality. That's really what it is. Democracy can only function if we can at least agree on what is happening. What are the facts? The point of democracy is that we disagree on how to respond to those facts. But if our ability to understand reality, to understand what's actually happening, if that can be frustrated, how can we hold a vote on what we should do if we can't have an agreement on what is happening in the first place? And that is the intentional strategy, I think. So no, I don't think this will be effective in any way advancing the public interest. The concept of making these platforms and providers, again, be whether it's the hate speech police, whether it's being the fake news police, is fundamentally mistaken. If an individual is engaged in demonstrably unlawful conduct that is not constitutionally protected, is not in accordance with rights or whatever, the police should go after these people as individuals. That's how things work in a free society. Someone goes beyond what their rights guarantee and begins infringing upon the rights of others. You investigate them, you indict them, you charge them, and if you can prove guilt, you punish them. But we see governments trying to break that loop, going, no, investigation's too hard, or it's too politically fractious, or we don't want to do this. And instead they go, well, why don't we make these companies do it instead? And we see this happening in the United States right now, exactly the same as in Brazil, just with a different explanation. Instead of using fake news, they go, oh, it's the protection of children. They go, we want to make sure major service providers, Facebook, Apple, Google, they don't provide encrypted messaging systems that the state cannot read. They don't want any private conversation to exist anywhere. They only want conversations that are nominally private, but the state also has an ear on it if they should choose to. And they're calling this the Earn It Act, going, you will get protection from liability as you already have under US laws, so long as you don't provide these spaces in which the state can't interfere with. If you do, because of terrorism, because of children, because of whatever, you'll lose that liability. And now you can get sued to death. You'll be responsible for any bad things that happen in your platform. And again, it's the same in Brazil. They go, oh, you let a story that we don't like, that we consider false to happen. You're responsible for it. You'll take some punishment for it. Instead of the person who created it, instead of the person who posted it, instead of the person who spread it. But you have to understand the nature of these companies. They will always go to what is the safest, most rewarding position for them. Not what's the most rewarding position for the public. And we might like to think that those positions are consistent. They're one and the same. What benefits the company is what benefits the public. But if you look back at the last decades of history, we all know that corporate interests are in a real way often fundamentally in conflict with the public interest.
Yeah, I like your metaphor about the internet having been the child and is now in its teenage years. Well, the internet did represent the promise of some sort of a digital utopia, a place where people would finally gather around in global conversation, in some sort of a digital global democracy. In reality, we are more tribal. We are immersed in bubbles with less contact with people who think differently than us. And you've been mentioning populists. I mean, here in Brazil, this problem is huge. Yeah. Populist leaders are elected all around the world in both mature and immature democracies. There are, of course, stress privacy, as constantly mentioned. How should we act to protect democracy? I mean, I understand democracy will naturally change, but what's the path?
I mean, this is the most difficult question, I think, of the day. In a time of universal conflict, how do we save democracy? I'm not sure I have the answer. And that's also kind of the point of democracy, is one of us does not have to be smart enough for all of us. All of us have to be smart enough for all of us, collectively, right? And this is what I think we've lost in the last decades. This is what has led to this surly internet phase. This is what has led to this surly global phase. What's happened in the span of my lifetime is a global awareness. We have moved from thinking locally in terms of towns and cities to thinking of what was in the reach of our radio broadcasts, to thinking what was in reach of our national news broadcasts, to now finally thinking internationally, now thinking globally, now thinking about everything. And the reality is, thinking about the world is terrifying, because the world is a big place and the problems are great. People have become scared. They have felt small. They have felt frightened. They have looked at the challenges that we face, and they have become fearful. They have realized how unequal the world is. They have realized how unequal their communities are, their nations are, their economies are. And when they have entered a position of personal vulnerability, they have entered a position of political vulnerability, that has now been capitalized on by these, again, authoritarian populist leaders. And I want to be clear that we have had authoritarian leaders even before the rise of populism. Obama was an authoritarian leader. Bush was an authoritarian leader. You could say, in a way, even a Dilma was an authoritarian leader. But this is simply because when you are a national government, you start to see the law as a blunt instrument for shaping behavior. And that's simply how far we've progressed. We haven't come up with a better system yet. Now, when we look at the failings, when we look at the vulnerabilities, when we look at how to move beyond that, I think what we have lost, again, is the sense of the individual responsibility and the collective responsibility. We have become so frightened of the world that we have been willing to invest whatever small fraction of political power we hold through, for example, our vote, into whoever was willing to promise to solve our problems. In previous generations, in previous elections, that would be the person who promised hope. and change. And now it's going to the person who promises to vanquish our adversaries. But now we are beginning, I think, particularly in the countries that are suffering under these most authoritarian populist leaders, suffer the consequences of that rule, and seeing that they are not being led, they are being ruled. And I don't think people want to be ruled. I think they would prefer to be led. But that is not a lesson that really seems to endure in humanity beyond the living memory, right? This is, unfortunately, a lesson that we have to learn ourselves, and it is a painful lesson. But we are beginning to see, I think, the lived consequences of our poor political choices. And that means that as we move into these next cycles, as we see someone like a Bolsonaro who came to power through kinds of corruption, like through a Sergio Moro, you are looking at the imprisonment of the opposition and all of these things. And you're starting to get a glimpse of what a future of this perpetual policy of punishment would look like. And when you have that, you start to go, all right, maybe the institutions aren't going to fix things. And maybe the election cycle is not going to fix things. Maybe things have to start with me. Maybe things have to start with the conversations that I have. Maybe things that have to change with the communities that I'm engaged in. Maybe I need to persuade people. Maybe I need to participate. Maybe I need to make better choices. And basically, we start to reach the idea that makes democracy hold so much power in its initial form. Or right now, none of us really have democracy. We have this idea of a representative democracy. Whether direct democracy is better or worse in a world that's awash with ignorance and we have no reliable sources of information, everything's in question, that's up